Har Karkum. This mountaintop in the Negev desert of southern Israel is littered with the charred fragments of an asteroid impact that formed the Ramon crater to our north. When the nation of Israel camped here during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they chiseled more than 40,000 petroglyphs into these burned asteroid fragments. Some of these labor-intensive etchings appear to be little more than the artistic expression of young shepherd boys tending the flock. But this petroglyph of sandaled feet is one of the ancient property markers of the sons of Israel, who were promised by the Almighty, every place that the sole of your foot shall tread, that have I given you as your inheritance, from the river Euphrates to the great river in Egypt. That promise was taken literally, and the Israelites etched the imprint of their sandaled feet into the very stones of the land as they went. Every place that these petroglyphs of sandaled feet are found legally belongs to Israel, including the vast oil field of Midian in Saudi Arabia, where thousands of these footprints, fixed in stone, record the identity of the true owners of the land. I'm Michael Rood. Prepare for a rude awakening.
Prepare for a rude awakening.
Religious traditions can blind us from truths that have eluded us for thousands of years. Recently, a team of scientists and archaeologists followed the route of Israel's exodus from Egypt as it was recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures 3,400 years ago, a route that has been ignored by modern theologians because it didn't fit with tradition. That path led them to an underwater land bridge that joins the Egyptian peninsula to the ancient land of Midian in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Along that bridge, they found the remains of Egyptian chariots strewn like battlefield wreckage on the bottom of the Red Sea, now known as the Gulf of Aqaba. That path continues on as the overland route to Jebel al-Lawz, Mount Sinai in northwest Saudi Arabia. There, Israel's ancient campsite is littered with domestic debris, thousands of stone arrowheads, and Israel's permanent title deed to the land, petroglyphs of their sandaled feet etched in stone. In 1978, an amateur archaeologist discovered this ancient Phoenician-style pillar from the First Temple period on the shores of the Yam Suf, the Red Sea. The Israeli Army Corps of Engineers lifted it from the shoreline and set it into concrete. Here, across this expansive sea, coral-encrusted chariot parts were found and later documented with sophisticated underwater robotic cameras in the spring of the year 2000. The discovery of Israel's crossing site fit every detail of the record in the Hebrew Scriptures, but it violated every man-made theological position held by the Christian church since the time of Constantine. Constantine's mother, Helena, said that Mount Sinai was in the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. But Shaul, a first-century Messianic Jew from Tarsus, also known in the West as Paul the Apostle, recorded that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. Braving interception by military gunships patrolling the Gulf of Aqaba, Ronald Eldon Wyatt crossed this 8-mile expanse in a rubber raft to explore the forbidden Arabian shore. There, an identical pillar was found, still standing. It bore Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions indicating that King Solomon erected these pillars as a memorial of the miracle of the crossing of the Yam Suf on dry ground. For several years, Wyatt attempted to obtain a visa to explore the mountain in Saudi Arabia known as Jebel al-Lawz, as the possible site for the biblical Mount Sinai. Unable to get into Arabia legally, Wyatt and his 2 sons entered Arabia in 1984 by crossing the Jordanian desert in the dark of the night and then hiring their way to the mountain that the local Bedouins referred to as Jabal Musa, or the Mountain of Moses. When the Wyatts arrived at the mountain, they were astonished at what they saw. There, at the base of the mountain, within the rim of an extinct volcano, was a huge plain, littered with domestic debris. Broken potsherds by the millions bore testimony to a multitude living here for an extended period. Broken grinding stones that had once transformed manna into flour were left behind on the windswept desert floor. The Wyatts took scores of photographs and then attempted to make their way back to Israel, but they were apprehended at the Arabian border. An archaeologist who had been entrusted with the details of Wyatt's mission was motivated by professional envy and alerted the Saudi government that 3 Israeli spies, matching the Wyatts' descriptions, would be crossing the border. The Wyatts were held in an Arabian prison pending trial on international espionage charges. If they were unable to prove their innocence, they would be executed as spies. After 76 days of interrogation, a Saudi prince and 2 archaeologists from Riyadh University flew out to the prison to question Wyatt about his story. Wyatt was then transported to Jabal al-Lawz and guided the prince and the archaeologist on a tour of the site. When they were shown this giant altar constructed of unhewn stones, they were convinced. On the altar were more than a dozen petroglyphs of the Egyptian cow and bull gods of prosperity, Apis and Hathor. This was not Arabian. This was definitely Egyptian art, depicting Egyptian gods. The Saudi archaeologists were convinced that this was the altar that Israel constructed for the golden calf. The Saudi government immediately declared the mountain, the altar, and the surrounding encampment to be an archaeological site by royal decree. The government enclosed the mountain and altar within a security fence and established a military guard to secure the site. The Wyatts were immediately released and returned to the U.S. to tell their story on national television. In subsequent years, other adventurers would follow Wyatt's map and return with even more compelling evidence. Bob Cornuke and Larry Williams made an illegal trek to the mountain and wrote of their adventures in the historical novel, The Gold of the Exodus. Vivica Pontien, an independent researcher from Stockholm, Sweden, made several trips to the mountain and returned with film documentation as well as ancient artifacts. But it was an American oil field engineer assigned to the oil fields of Saudi Arabia and his wife who spent more than 9 years scouting, photographing, and collecting artifacts from the Mountain of Moses who give us the most compelling testimony. After nearly a decade of securing archaeological evidence from the real Mount Sinai, James and Penny Caldwell can now tell publicly a story that had to be kept secret during their years of working undercover in the Arabian Peninsula.
I was working for Saudi Aramco in the winter of 1991. I became infatuated with the idea of going to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. So we spent a month in Egypt searching out the path of Israel's exodus and the biblical Mount Sinai. I was obsessed with the idea of being on the mountain where the 10 Commandments were written by the finger of Yahweh. The only way I can describe it is I was driven. I had to go. We arrived at St. Catherine's Monastery, Constantine the Great's Mount Sinai. Well, it was the pinnacle of disappointment. I was confused. I'd had such an intense, unexplainable drive to get to Mount Sinai, and now I had such an empty feeling. To ease our family's disappointment, we continued our tour of Egypt and finally ended up at the seaside resort of Sharm el-Sheikh on the shore of the Red Sea.
Now, the day after we arrived, I bought a book at the hotel's gift shop, and it was entitled The Gold Mines of Midian, which was written in the 1800s by Sir Richard Burton. His hand-penned map showed that the land of Midian was in northwest Arabia. Now, Moses was a shepherd in Midian, and we all know he had a divine encounter at Mount Sinai. So why did we ever think that Mount Sinai was in the Egyptian peninsula? The next day, another book was added to the rack entitled The Mountain of God by Emmanuel Anati. One of the candidates Anadi listed for the real Mount Sinai was Jebel Oz in northwest Saudi Arabia, in the ancient land of Midian. Now he showed photos of petroglyphs that were etched right into the rocks at Har Kharkoum, which is one of the places that Israel camped during their 40 years in the wilderness. And he also listed a number of artifacts and features that were recorded in the Bible that should be in evidence if you found the true Mount Sinai. Now these artifacts and physical features were all absent from Hellenist Sinai.
We weren't disappointed by the real Mount Sinai. We were let down by an ancient tourist trap picked out by Constantine's mother, Helena. I raced to the truck and pulled out my maps and marked out the quickest route to Jebel al-Lawz. A few days later, we stopped at a hotel on the beach at Nuweiba, Egypt. As soon as we arrived, the owner of the hotel took me aside and unfolded a hand-drawn map. He related to us that the map had been given to him by an American who had trespassed into Saudi Arabia to investigate a mountain that he thought could match the biblical description of Mount Sinai. What we didn't know at the time was that that American had been captured and imprisoned after finding the mountain and was deported after having been stripped of the evidence. The American had offered this Egyptian a very large sum of money to photograph specific ruins in Arabia if he could get a visa into the country. The ruins he was referring to perfectly matched some of the descriptions that we had read in Anadi's book just days before. I carefully studied the map and suddenly realized this was the very mountain that I had already mapped out a route to just yesterday. I had been led by the hand of the Almighty to the two places on the Red Sea where the clues of the route of the Exodus and the location of the real Mount Sinai had been prepared and were waiting for me. I now knew where to find the mountain of God, right where it had always been, in the land of Midian in northwest Saudi Arabia, where Moses pastured his sheep 3,500 years ago.
Now our route out to the real Mount Sinai was really a dangerous family adventure. Our kids, Lucas and Chelsea, explored that Sinai mountain range with us year after year as we collected the data and the artifacts for analysis. Now when we first arrived out there to the mountain, we found out that the Arabian government was not playing games. The Saudis had erected a chain-link security fence there at the base of the mountain, and there's actually a guardhouse inside the fence and no trespassing signs in both Arabic and English. There's a stone altar out there too, with petroglyphs of Apis and Hathor, and it's completely surrounded by a security fence.
During our 15 expeditions to the mountain over the next decade, we were able to get inside the fence and take detailed pictures for a closer study. We investigated the remains of an altar and a corral where animals were guided to the sacrificial area. In the surrounding desert to the south, we saw thousands of Egyptian-style arrowheads, some with military points for battling the Amalekites, some with the bird points for hunting quail, and other arrowheads for hunting the wild ibex sheep, which still populate the wilderness.
Now, as we were collecting the evidence, we provided copies of the photographs and the videos and even some of the artifacts to the American who had drawn the map, Ron Wyatt. And then we provided even more footage to Bob Cornuke, who had also been out there to the mountain. Our videos and photographs were literally being circulated around the globe, but nobody was allowed to disclose the source because we were still living in Arabia. We were arrested and we were questioned by the authorities on numerous occasions, but we continued to carry out the documentation year after year. And there were a lot of people that doubted the authenticity of the evidence that was circulating during our years in Midian, and that's primarily because those who broadcast the information were very true to their promise to protect us. They had been there, and they knew that our lives and the lives of our children were in danger. But now we're safely back in America, and we can tell you all the rest of the story.
Now we can take you with us as we explore the 45-foot tall rock that was split open when Moses struck it with his staff. The granite polished smooth when water gushed out to provide for the millions of people and livestock. We take you behind the security fence to view the altar to the golden calf in all of its detail. We take you into the cave that Elijah dwelt in when he heard the still small voice. We take you to the altar that Moses built after his victory over the Amalekites. We take you to Elim, the place of 12 wells and 70 palm trees where Israel was refreshed on their way to Mount Sinai. Then we take you on a journey to see the most exciting discovery of our entire adventure, a discovery that has great significance for the nation of Israel in the last days.
The scriptures record that the ancient land of Midian is where Moses came upon the burning bush on Mount Sinai while tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro. Moses was instructed to bring Israel back to that very mountain in Midian to worship the Elohim of their fathers. After the miracle of the crossing of the Red Sea on dry ground and the destruction of the Egyptian army that followed them, Israel was refreshed at the 12 wells of Elim, which produce fresh water to this very day. At Sinai, Israel constructed an altar to a golden calf and built 2 other sacrificial altars in the area. And Moses struck a rock from which flowed a river of water in the desert. All of these features are still visible in the ancient land of Midian, yet not one of these features are evident at Helena Sinai. After nearly 2,000 years of false traditions, it turns out that the Hebrew Scriptures and Rav Shaul are both correct. Mount Sinai is in Arabia. The petroglyphs of sandal feet that we find here at Har Karkum are an exact match to the petroglyphs found at Mount Sinai and throughout Saudi Arabia. For 40 years, the Israelites followed a blazing pillar of fire that warmed them through the night and a cooling cloud by day that sheltered them from the blistering desert sun. When the cloud moved, the nation of Israel followed. When the cloud stood still, they set up camp again. The Hebrew Scriptures record that Israel made 42 camps during those years, but there are not 42 metropolitan-sized camping sites between Mount Sinai and the land of the Canaanites. Where are these 42 camps of Israel?
We found hundreds of these petroglyphs of the sandaled feet of the Israelites scattered throughout Saudi Arabia. They are heavily concentrated in the vicinity of the split rock. We believe these footprints are the actual title deed to the inheritance of Abraham's offspring, and in them is the key that will unlock the mystery of the route of the Israelites during their 40 years in the wilderness.
Our time for travel and access in this part of the world was severely restricted, so we were unable to follow all the paths where the footprints would lead. But from our years of following the property markers of the Israelites, we believe that the pillar of fire led Israel right through the Arabian Peninsula and to all the places that Abraham trod when the Lord said to him, "Rise up and walk the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it."
When the Almighty shouted down his original 10 instructions to Israel from Mount Sinai, he stated clearly, "Thou shalt have no other gods al panai," literally from the Hebrew, "in my face." He shortly thereafter strengthened this statement by commanding, "Do not even utter the names of pagan gods or serve me in any way that resembles the acts of the heathen. It is an abomination." The Israelites, however, just released from the bondage of a pagan culture, fashioned an Egyptian golden calf to represent their faith in the true God. Aaron cried out, "Tomorrow is a feast to Yahweh." The Almighty was so impressed by their display of devotion to him by dedicating a pagan festival to his honor that he wanted to incinerate the entire nation. "No," he said, "do not serve me in the way that the heathen worship their gods and say that you're doing it for me. I know better. If you want to worship me, obey my commandments and have a feast to me 3 times a year, exactly the way that I prescribe." The Almighty hates pagan celebrations derived from Babylonian sun god worship. If you say you love him, keep his commandments. They are not grievous. It is now time to come out of Babylon. Modern religionists have scoffed at the authenticity of the Hebrew Scriptures, substituting their own rules and regulations for the simple, life-giving commandments of the Almighty. In the ancient land of Midian, in the very place where Moses tended his flocks, the Almighty has preserved a testimony in the stones of Sinai so that the entire world may know that the commandments and covenants contained in the Scriptures are eternal. The promises and requirements of the Creator of the universe will not fade away from that which is written in the everlasting Torah. I'm Michael Rood, inviting you to join us again next time for A Rood Awakening. And I'll see you when the smoke clears.